The storm had come out of nowhere. One moment the sky was clear, a deep indigo stretching endlessly over the rolling fields. The next, dark clouds had swallowed the stars, and the wind carried the scent of rain and distant thunder. Willie adjusted his coat, tugging it tighter around himself as he latched the barn doors. The animals inside were restless more than usual. Horses shifted uneasily in their stalls, their ears flicking at every distant rumble. Even the dogs, usually unbothered by the weather, paced anxiously near the entrance, noses twitching. Something felt off. Willie had lived alone on this farm for years, long enough to trust his instincts. He couldn't explain it, but there was a weight in the air, something electric, something unnatural. It wasn't just the storm rolling in, it was something else. As he turned toward the house, rain started to fall in thick, heavy drops, the wind picking up until it howled through the trees. The screen door creaked as he stepped onto the porch, shaking off the cold. But just as he reached for the handle, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A shape, small, crumpled, barely distinguishable in the storm, was slumped against the railing. His heart jumped. What the hell? He grabbed the flashlight from his belt, its beam cutting through the darkness. The figure didn't move. It was curled in on itself, as if trying to make itself smaller, arms wrapped around a thin, trembling body. Then the light hit her. Willie froze. The woman was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin, vibrant green like deep forest leaves wet with rain, glistened under the beam, smooth and unnatural. Her long black hair was plastered to her face, tangled and soaked, clinging to high cheekbones and delicate features that were unmistakably not human. She was wearing something, fabric, that had once been whole, now torn and barely hanging onto her frame. She was thin, too thin. Her eyes flickered open at the light, and Willie sucked in a breath. They glowed, not in a way that reflected the beam, but from within. Soft, golden, alien. They locked onto his, hazy with exhaustion, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then she sagged forward, her body giving out. "Shit," Willem muttered, stepping forward. She twitched at his movement, her hands weakly grasping at the wooden railing as if she wanted to push herself up, but there was no strength left in her. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, and her entire body trembled from cold and exhaustion. Every survival instinct in Willie screamed caution. She was something else, something unknown, but she was also dying. Cursing under his breath, he knelt beside her. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low and calm, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "Can you hear me?" Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her throat worked as if she wanted to respond, but nothing came. Damn it. His hesitation lasted only a second. Whoever she was, whatever she was, she had ended up here, on his doorstep, and right now, that made her his responsibility. "All right," he sighed. "Let's get you inside." He slid his arms beneath her, one supporting her back, the other slipping under her knees. She was impossibly light, her frame barely more than skin and bone. The moment he lifted her, her entire body went rigid. Willie barely had time to react before she weakly grabbed at his jacket, her fingers barely curling into the fabric. It wasn't an attack. It was something instinctual, a desperate, unconscious plea to hold on to something. "It's all right," he murmured. "I've got you." She didn't reply, didn't fight, just sagged against him, her body giving in to exhaustion. As he carried her inside, rain pounded against the porch roof, and a streak of lightning split the sky. For a brief second, the entire world flashed in stark white light. And in that flash, Willie saw something on her skin, faint, barely noticeable against the green, but definitely there. Scars. Thin, jagged lines that ran along her arms and down her collarbone. Some old, some newer. Someone had hurt her. His jaw tightened, but he didn't stop. He pushed open the door with his shoulder, stepping inside and kicking it shut behind him. The warmth of the house hit instantly, the fireplace still burning from earlier, filling the room with the scent of smoldering wood. Carefully, he lowered her onto the couch, grabbing the old wool blanket draped over the backrest and wrapping it around her. He didn't stir. Her breathing was still shallow, but at least it was steady. The tremors racking her body were slowing, the warmth starting to take effect. Willie exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. What the hell was he supposed to do now? For years his life had been simple, quiet. He had built this farm with his own hands, choosing solitude over the chaos of the outside world. It was easier that way. No complications, no responsibilities beyond his land and the animals that depended on him. But now, there was her. A green-skinned, golden-eyed mystery bleeding out on his couch. Why had she come here? Had she meant to come here? Or had she just collapsed in the first place she could find? And, more importantly, was someone looking for her? Willie glanced at the window. The storm had swallowed the world outside, making it impossible to see anything beyond the porch, but the unease in his gut hadn't faded. Something had led her here, and if she was running from something, it might not be far behind. He looked back at her. Her face was still, her breathing deep, but up close he could see more details. The faint pulse of light beneath her skin, subtle but unmistakable, almost like the embers of a dying fire flickering with each breath she took. She wasn't just different. She was something else entirely. And like it or not, she was now his problem. Willie had never been one to entertain company, let alone nurse an unconscious alien back to health. Yet here he was, standing in his dimly lit living room, watching over the green-skinned woman lying on his couch. The storm still raged outside, rain hammering against the windows, the wind howling through the trees. But inside, it was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the woman's shallow breathing. She hadn't stirred since he brought her in. He had given her a blanket, made sure she was warm, even placed a glass of water on the nearby table, not that he had any idea if she even drank water. Now, as he stood over her, hands on his hips, he felt the weight of a dozen unanswered questions pressing down on him. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why the hell had she collapsed on his doorstep? A part of him considered the possibility that she wasn't alone, that something or someone had chased her here. His eyes flicked toward the shotgun mounted above the fireplace. He hadn't needed it in years, but tonight he was suddenly grateful it was there. Willie sighed and ran a hand through his damp hair. He didn't know what to do with her. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a scientist. Hell, he wasn't even sure he was a good person by most people's standards. He had built his life out here on this farm to get away from the world, to be left alone. And yet here he was, not leaving her alone. He sank into the old wooden chair beside the couch, letting out a slow breath. The firelight flickered across her face, casting soft shadows over her sharp cheekbones and delicate features. Up close, she looked even more fragile than he had realized. And then she moved. It was just a small shift, her fingers twitching beneath the blanket, but it was enough to make him tense. A second later, her breathing changed, deepening slightly. She was waking up. Willie leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching as her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she just stared at the ceiling, golden irises catching the firelight. Then, slowly, she turned her head and met his gaze. Neither of them spoke. She didn't bolt upright, didn't scream or recoil. Instead, she simply blinked at him, her expression unreadable. "Ah, hey," Willie said, unsure of what else to say. The silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, she tried to sit up. "Oh, hold on." Willie reached out instinctively, his hands hovering near her shoulders. "Take it easy." She paused, her eyes flicking to his hands before settling back on his face. Then, carefully, she pushed herself upright, wincing slightly as she moved. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing more of the strange markings along her arms. Scars, thin and jagged, some newer than others. Willie pretended not to notice. Instead, he gestured toward the glass of water. "Figured you might need that." She eyed the glass suspiciously before hesitantly reaching for it. Her fingers curled around it awkwardly, as if she wasn't used to holding something so fragile. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she brought it to her lips and took a small sip. Willie exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. "Guess that answers one question," he muttered. She lowered the glass, her gaze never leaving his. Finally, after another long pause, she spoke. "Sahriya." Her voice was quiet, rough from disuse, but steady. Willie frowned. "That's your name?" She nodded once. Willie nodded back, leaning against the armrest. "All right, I'm Willie." More silence. She studied him, her golden eyes sharp and calculating. It was like she was trying to decide whether he was a threat or not. "You're safe here," Willie added after a beat. "No one's gonna hurt you." Daria didn't react, but something in her posture shifted. Something subtle, like she wanted to believe him, but wasn't sure she could. "Mind telling me what the hell happened to you?" he asked. Her grip tightened slightly around the glass. She looked away, staring into the fire. For a long time, she didn't answer. Then, just when he thought she wouldn't, she whispered, "I ran." Willie frowned. "From what?" Saria's jaw tensed. She set the glass down carefully on the table, then pulled the blanket back around herself. "I can't stay," she said, more to herself than to him. Willie crossed his arms. "You can barely sit up. You're not going anywhere tonight." She clenched her hands into fists. "I shouldn't be here." Willie sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Well, you are here, and from the looks of it, you've been through hell, so maybe take a minute before you start planning your next escape." Her eyes snapped to his, sharp and guarded. "You're not going to kick me out?" she asked. Willie scoffed. "What, and let you collapse in the dirt again? No thanks. You stay until you can stand without falling over." Saria stared at him, as if trying to read between the lines of his words, searching for deception. When she found none, she exhaled and leaned back against the couch. "Okay," she murmured. That single word felt heavier than it should have. Willie didn't know why, but he got the sense that no one had ever told her she could stay before. And that thought sat uncomfortably in his chest. The morning arrived with a cold, gray stillness, the kind that settled deep into the bones of the land after a heavy storm. The air smelled of damp earth and wet wood, and a faint mist hovered over the fields outside. Willie sat at the kitchen table, one hand curled around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He wasn't drinking it anymore, just holding on to the warmth, staring at the woman on his couch. Saria hadn't moved much. She was still wrapped in the old wool blanket he'd given her, her knees drawn slightly toward her chest. Though her breathing was even now, no longer the ragged, shallow gasps from the night before, there was a tension in her posture. She was awake, he knew it. The slow, deliberate way her chest rose and fell, the faint twitch of her fingers against the fabric of the couch, it was all too controlled for someone still asleep. She was listening. He took a slow sip of coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. "You gonna keep pretending, or are we gonna talk?" For a moment, nothing. Then, finally, Saria shifted, her golden eyes flickering open. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she blinked slowly, adjusting to the dim morning light filtering through the windows. Her gaze lingered on the fire, still burning low in the hearth, before it finally drifted toward him. They sat in silence, sizing each other up across the small space of the living room. Willie had seen a lot of things in his life. He'd met plenty of people who carried ghosts in their eyes, who had the look of someone who had seen too much, lost too much. Saria had that look now. But there was something else, too. She wasn't just wary, she was calculating. Willie exhaled through his nose, setting his mug down on the table with a dull thud. "You ran," he said simply. It wasn't a question. Zarya's fingers curled slightly against the blanket. I already told you that. Yeah, Willie said, leaning back in his chair. But you didn't tell me why. Her jaw tensed, and for the first time she looked away. Her gaze flickered to the window as if she expected to see something out there, something coming for her. That set Willie's nerves on edge. Someone looking for you? He asked, keeping his tone even. Silence. She didn't answer right away, and that was answer enough. Willie glanced toward the shotgun mounted on the wall. He hadn't needed it in a long time, but the way she was acting made him rethink that. If someone was after her, he needed to know. I don't know, Zarya said finally, voice quieter than before. He didn't believe that for a second. You sure about that? Her shoulders stiffened. She was guarded now, her walls going up piece by piece. Willie had seen it before, people who had spent too much time running, too much time surviving. They didn't trust easily, and they sure as hell didn't open up to strangers, which made what she said next all the more surprising. I was a soldier, she murmured. Willie's brow furrowed. He hadn't been expecting that. A soldier? Zarya nodded once, still not looking at him. Willie studied her. He thought about the scars on her arms, the way she moved, the quiet way she watched everything around her. It made sense. But it also meant trouble. What kind of war? He asked carefully. Zarya hesitated. A long one. Her voice was hollow, distant, like the weight of it all was still pressing down on her, dragging her under. Willie let the silence stretch between them. If she was going to talk, she needed to do it on her own terms. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she inhaled deeply and continued. My people, we were fighting for survival, she said, her fingers tightening around the blanket. It lasted for generations. I was trained for war before I was even grown. Willie frowned. That explained a lot. The way she carried herself, the way she reacted to everything, like someone who had never known peace, never known anything but battle. And you ran? He asked. Her golden eyes flickered toward him. Wouldn't you? Willie didn't answer. Because he knew the truth? Yeah, he would have. Zarya looked away again, her expression unreadable. I was supposed to die. The words sent a chill through the room. Willie sat up a little straighter. But you didn't? No. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The fire crackled softly, filling the space between them. Willie exhaled. And now? Zarya didn't respond. He let the silence settle for a while before he stood, grabbing his empty mug and crossing the room. He poured himself another cup of coffee, listening to the quiet behind him. Finally, he spoke. Well, you're here now. He heard her shift slightly on the couch. For how long? Willie turned, leaning against the counter. Guess that's up to you. Zarya stared at him for a long time. There was something different in her eyes now. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, a tiny crack in the walls she had built around herself. And for now that was enough. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that settled over the land after a storm had spent its fury. The sky stretched wide and dark above the farm, the air crisp with the lingering scent of rain-soaked earth. Willie stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the stars flicker between breaks in the passing clouds. Inside, Zarya stirred. He heard the soft creak of the old wooden floor as she moved, slow and careful. It had been 3 days since she arrived, and though she still carried herself with hesitation, she was stronger now. He had noticed it in the way she sat straighter, in how her golden eyes no longer carried the glassy haze of exhaustion. But the wariness, that never left. Willie exhaled, pushing away from the railing and stepping inside. She was standing near the fireplace, her back turned to him, staring into the flames. The blanket he had given her was still draped around her shoulders, but she was holding it more loosely now, as if she no longer needed it for warmth but found comfort in it anyway. You planning on staying up all night? Willie asked. Safria turned slightly, her gaze flickering to him before returning to the fire. I don't sleep much. Willie studied her for a moment before stepping closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. That because of the war? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a slow breath, her fingers curling into the fabric of the blanket. It's because of what comes after. Willie frowned. After? She finally looked at him, and in the firelight her golden eyes held something raw, something he hadn't seen before. After the fighting stops, she murmured. That's when it's the worst. Willie didn't know much about war, not the kind she had seen, but he knew what she meant. The quiet could be louder than the gunfire. The stillness could hold more weight than the chaos. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. Yeah, I get that. Safria's gaze lingered on him as if she was deciding whether to believe him or not. Then, slowly, she turned back toward the fire. A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like something unspoken had settled between them, something fragile but real. And then she shivered. It was slight, barely noticeable, but Willie caught it. Without thinking, he stepped forward and reached out, brushing his fingers against her arm. She went still. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, too warm, like the heat of the fire had seeped into her. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't pull away. Then, cautiously, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Willie didn't drop his hand. You all right? He asked, his voice quieter now. Safria hesitated. She should have stepped back, should have put space between them. Instead, she stayed close, her golden eyes searching his, as if trying to understand something even she didn't have the words for. I don't know, she admitted. Her voice was softer than before, almost uncertain. Willie swallowed. He wasn't sure what was happening here, wasn't sure what this was, but he knew that for the first time since she had arrived, she wasn't just letting him help her, she was letting him in. He exhaled, his fingers brushing over the scars along her arm. She didn't flinch. If you don't want me touching you, I do. The words left her so quickly that she seemed surprised by them herself. Willie stilled. Safria blinked, her throat working as she swallowed. Then cautiously she reached up and placed her hand over his. Her fingers were delicate but strong, curling lightly over his rougher skin. A quiet moment passed. Then she whispered, "This is new." Willie let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. Yeah. She didn't let go. Neither did he. And for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt like a beginning. The night was too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. Willie stood near the door, shotgun in hand, his grip firm but steady. His heartbeat was slow, measured, his body instinctively falling into the same focus he used when hunting. But this wasn't a hunt. This was a fight. Behind him, Safria was motionless, her golden eyes locked on the darkness beyond the shattered window. The moment she had whispered, "They found me," something inside her had changed. She wasn't trembling anymore. She wasn't running. She was waiting. A shadow shifted near the tree line, a flicker of movement barely visible in the dim moonlight. Then the first shot came. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Willie barely had time to react before he was yanking Safria down, covering her with his body as another round tore through the wall behind them. "They're not just here for you," he muttered, keeping his voice low. "No," Safria agreed, her voice eerily calm. "They'll burn everything down if they have to." Willie gritted his teeth. "Not if we kill them first." Safria's hand curled into the fabric of his shirt, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. "If we do this, there's no turning back." Willie's eyes locked onto hers. "You think I don't know that?" She held his gaze, searching for something. Fear, doubt, regret. But she found none. And that was when she decided, Saria exhaled slowly, then nodded. Willie moved first. He rolled onto his feet, staying low as he maneuvered toward the corner of the room. The moment he reached the edge of the window, he caught sight of them, dark figures advancing through the field, their weapons raised. 5, no 6 of them. Not hired thugs, not some ragtag group of bounty hunters. These men moved in formation, coordinated. They weren't here to chase her, they were here to end this. That worked just fine for Willie. He didn't hesitate. He fired. The first blast tore through the night, the shotgun kicking against his shoulder as one of the figures dropped. The others reacted instantly, diving for cover, but Willie was already moving. He darted toward the back of the house, yanking Saria along with him. More shots rang out. Wood splintered. They barely made it into the kitchen before Sahira yanked him to a stop. "No," she said firmly. "We can't just fight like this, not on their terms." Willie narrowed his eyes. "Then what's your plan?" Saria turned toward him, stepping closer, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin, close enough that when she spoke, he could see something else in her expression, something not just determined, but deadly. "I stop holding back," she murmured. A pulse of energy rippled through the air, faint but undeniable. Willie's breath hitched. "Saria?" She lifted a hand and pressed it against his chest, fingers splaying over his heartbeat. A warmth spread from her touch, sinking into his skin like the static before a lightning strike. "I need you to trust me," she whispered. Willie swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to keep fighting, to take control of the battle the way he always had, but this wasn't his fight. It was theirs. So instead of arguing, instead of hesitating, he nodded, and Saria let go. The shift was instant. The air around them vibrated, humming with an energy he couldn't see but could feel deep in his bones. Outside, the attackers moved closer, their boots crunching through the wet grass. But they weren't the only ones closing in. The storm was coming back. Not a natural storm, not one shaped by winds or weather. One shaped by her. The first soldier barely had time to react before it hit. A shockwave erupted outward from the house, sending a pulse of crackling green light through the field. Willie flinched at the force of it, but Saria stood firm, her expression unyielding. The men staggered. The leader, a tall figure clad in dark combat gear, lifted a hand and barked an order into a radio. Willie knew that tone. It wasn't panic, it was adjustment. These men were trained for this. Saria knew it too. "I need more time," she said. Willie rolled his shoulders, tightening his grip on the shotgun. "Then let's buy you some." He moved fast, slipping around the side of the house and leveling his weapon. The first man who had recovered from the blast barely had time to lift his rifle before Willie fired again. Another one down. 3 left standing. The leader turned toward him, raising his own weapon. But before he could pull the trigger, a second wave of energy slammed into them, this one sharper, more controlled. Saria wasn't just pushing them back. She was taking them apart. One of the remaining men dropped his gun and ran. The leader, the only one left standing, watched as his squad crumbled. He looked back toward the house, toward Saria, his expression shifting from confidence to something colder. Resignation. Willie saw it before he moved. The man reached for his radio, not a weapon. A signal. Willie didn't hesitate. He fired. The leader hit the ground. Silence. Willie's chest rose and fell, his breath heavy, his pulse still pounding. His body was tense, waiting for another movement, another shot. But there was nothing. It was over. Saria exhaled, her shoulders slumping. The glow that had surrounded her flickered, then faded, leaving only the crackle of distant thunder in its place. Willie walked toward her, stepping over the bodies, his boots heavy against the damp earth. When he reached her, he let the shotgun hang loosely in his grip. "You all right?" he asked. Saria didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers as if testing them. Then finally she lifted her gaze to meet his. "Yes," she said, and for the first time he believed it. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. "Good." Saria's golden eyes lingered on him. Then, without warning, she stepped closer, so close that he could feel her warmth, feel the remnants of her power still humming beneath her skin. "Willie." Her voice was quieter now, steadier. He tilted his head. "Yeah?" She hesitated for only a second. Then she reached up, pressing a hand against his chest again. Not for power, not for strength, just to feel him there. And Willie, despite everything, despite the bodies, the fight, the fact that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand, reached up and covered her hand with his own. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The battlefield was silent now. The bodies of their attackers lay scattered across the wet grass, their weapons abandoned, their mission failed. Smoke curled from the remains of the gunfire, drifting lazily into the cool night air. The sky had cleared, and in the far distance, the first hints of dawn threatened the horizon, washing the world in deep purples and faint golds. Willie stood in the middle of it all, his shotgun hanging loosely in one hand, his pulse still steady from the fight. He should have been exhausted, should have felt something, relief, anger, maybe even fear. But all he felt was done. This was his land, his home, and for the first time there was no one left to take it from him. A soft breath behind him made him turn. Saria stood a few steps away, her golden eyes reflecting the dying firelight, her expression unreadable. The wind stirred her dark hair, brushing it across her face, but she didn't move to fix it. She was staring at the fallen soldiers, her body still tense, as if expecting another fight. "It's over," Willie said. Her gaze flicked to him, and for a long moment she didn't answer. Then finally she exhaled and nodded. They won't send more," she murmured. "Not after this?" Willie raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "They'll be too afraid to." She wasn't boasting, there was no arrogance in her voice, just cold, simple truth. And for the first time, Willie realized something. Saria wasn't just a survivor. She wasn't just running. She had won. He let out a slow breath, shifting his grip on the shotgun before slinging it over his shoulder. His body ached, but it was the kind of ache that came from something finished, something resolved. "So what now?" he asked. Saria hesitated, her fingers flexed at her sides before she looked back at him. "I don't know," she admitted. Willie huffed a quiet laugh. "Hell, neither do I." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder away. The farmhouse still stood, battered but unbroken. The land stretched before them, untouched beyond the scars of battle. Saria stepped closer. It wasn't a hesitant movement, not like before. It was deliberate, confident. "Before this," she said softly, "I never thought about after." Willie tilted his head. "After?" She nodded, her golden eyes searching his. "I spent so long running, I didn't think I'd ever stop. That I'd ever get to stop." She glanced past him, toward the house. The same house she had collapsed in front of days ago, broken and desperate. Now she stood before it whole, her shoulders squared, her stance strong. "This place," she murmured. "It was supposed to be temporary." Willie felt something tighten in his chest. He forced his voice to stay steady. "And now?" Saria looked at him, really looked at him. Then, slowly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed over his forearm, then slid down, twining lightly with his. It was so simple, so natural, that it stole his breath for a second. Willie had spent most of his life alone. He had never needed anyone, never wanted to share his quiet world with someone else. But standing there, Saria's hand in his, he realized he didn't want her to leave. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then finally Saria squeezed his hand. "Now, I think I'd like to stay." Willie felt something settle in his chest. Not tension, not uncertainty, just He tightened his grip on her hand. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think I'd like that too." And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, spilling light across the land, neither of them moved. Because for the first time, there was nothing to run from. The house stood strong once again. The scars of battle remained, bullet holes patched, shattered windows replaced, the scent of fresh-cut wood still clinging to the walls. But it was whole. They had rebuilt it together, much like themselves. Willie leaned against the doorway, rolling his sore shoulder, watching the last streaks of sunset fade beyond the horizon. His hands ached from a full day's work, but the exhaustion felt good, like something real, something earned. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of Saria through the dim firelight. She was sitting near the hearth, cross-legged on the floor, absent-mindedly running her fingers over the surface of a wooden beam they had repaired that morning. Her skin glowed faintly in the flickering light, her golden eyes thoughtful, lips slightly parted as if caught in some unspoken thought. For days they had fought, endured, survived. But now there was only this. No running, no threats. Just the quiet hum of a world settling back into place. Willie stepped forward, boots scuffing softly against the worn floorboards. Saria lifted her gaze, watching him approach. Something unreadable passed through her expression, something curious, expectant. He sank down beside her, stretching his legs out, letting the heat from the fire warm the aches in his muscles. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in it. Then, softly, she spoke. "You built this place yourself?" Willie nodded, tilting his head against the wall. "Yeah." Saria traced a finger over the wood again. "It suits you." He smirked. "What, busted up windows and patched bullet holes?" Her lips twitched, but then her expression grew serious. "No. Strong. Stubborn. Standing when it shouldn't." Her words settled between them, heavier than they should have been, because she wasn't just talking about the house. Willie swallowed, his throat dry. She had changed since the night she collapsed on his doorstep, and so had he. He felt it every time she looked at him like this, like he was something solid in a world that had always been shifting beneath her feet. And damn it, he liked the way she looked at him. He exhaled slowly, his fingers curling against his knee. "You ever think about leaving?" She was quiet for a long time. Then finally, "No." The word was simple but final. She shifted then, moving closer, closing the space between them in a way that made his pulse slow and quicken at the same time. Willie didn't move as she reached for him, her fingers trailing lightly over his forearm before sliding lower, curling around his hand. Her touch was warm, deliberate. "I don't want to run anymore," she murmured. Willie turned his hand over, pressing his palm against hers. He traced his thumb slowly along the inside of her wrist, feeling the steady beat of her pulse beneath his fingertips. It was fast. Not from fear. From something else. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Saria moved first. She leaned in slowly, almost cautiously, giving him time to stop her if he wanted to. But he didn't. Their lips met softly at first, a careful brush, a hesitant question. But the moment his hands came up, one sliding to the back of her neck, the other wrapping around her waist, the hesitation was gone. Saria made a soft noise, almost a sigh, as she pressed closer. She shifted, moving over him, straddling his lap as her hands found his shoulders. Willie's breath hitched as she settled against him, the heat of her body sinking into his. She had never been this close before, never let herself touch him like this. And she liked it. He could feel it in the way she moved, slow and unhurried, savoring the press of her body against his, the way his hands roamed her back. She buried her fingers in his hair, tilting his head back slightly as she deepened the kiss. Not demanding, not forceful, but undeniable. Willie groaned softly against her lips, his restraint unraveling with every passing second. When she pulled back slightly, just enough for them to breathe, her golden eyes were darker than before, her expression raw, unguarded. He traced a hand down her spine, feeling the slight shiver that ran through her. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, rough. She smiled then, slow and knowing. Yes, and that was all he needed. He rolled them effortlessly, pinning her beneath him against the worn wooden floor, the firelight painting golden streaks across her skin. Sahria arched into him as his hands moved over her, exploring, learning, mapping her out like she was something sacred. He took his time, and Sahira, who had never known softness, never been touched like this, let him. She welcomed it. The fire burned low, the night stretching endlessly around them. And for the first time, neither of them were alone. The end.